Syriac Christians are an ethnoreligious grouping of various ethnic communities of indigenous pre-Arab Semitic and often Neo-Aramaic-speaking Christian people of Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine and Israel. Syriac Christians advocate different terms for ethnic self-designation. Syriac Christians from the Middle East are theologically and culturally closely related to, but should not be confused with the St. Thomas Christians from India, whose ties to Syriac Christians were a result of trade links and migration by Assyrian Christians from Mesopotamia and the Middle East mostly. Around the 9th century, historically, the three ethnic names used to describe those who would become Syriac Christians were extant before the advent of Christianity. Assyrian, referring to the land and people of Assyria in northern Mesopotamia. Aramean, referring to the people of Aram in the Levant, and Syrian.Syriac, originally being used specifically as an Indo-European corruption of Assyrian, but from the late 4th century BC, being applied by the Seleucid Greeks to the Arameans of the Levant. Other purely doctrinal and theological terms such as Syriac Christian, Chaldean Catholic, Jacobite and Nestorian appeared much later, usually as labels imposed by theologians from Europe. The problem became more acute in 1946, when with the creation and independence of Syria, the adjective Syrian came to refer to that Arab-majority independent state, where Syriac Christians formed Christian ethnic minorities. There are around 7 million Syriac Christians of various ethnicities and denominations in the world, the majority living in the diaspora, with the largest centers being in India, the United States, Canada, Syrian Arab Republic, Sweden, Australia, Lebanon, Germany, Russia, the Netherlands, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Iraq, Turkey and Iran. History. In the pre-Christian era, during the Mid and Late Bronze Age and Iron Age, the northern part of Iraq and parts of southeast Turkey and northeast Syria were encompassed by Assyria from the 25th century BC, southern Iraq by Babylonia from the 19th century BC, the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon and Syria by Phoenicia from the 13th century BC, and the remainder of Syria together with parts of south-central Turkey by Aramea, also from the 13th century BC. Modern Israel, Jordan, the Palestinian territories and the Sinai Peninsula were encompassed by various Canaanite states from the 13th century BC, such as Israel, Judah, Samaria, Edom, Ammon, the Amalekites and Moab. The Arabs emerged in the Arabian Peninsula in the mid-9th century BC, and the long-extinct Chaldeans migrated to southeast Iraq from the Levant at the same time. This entire region fell under the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which introduced Imperial Aramaic as the lingua franca of its empire. Little changed under the succeeding Achaemenid Empire, which retained these lands as provinces under Achaemenid control, although some ethnicities and lands, such as Chaldea, Moab, Edom and Canaan, disappeared before the Achaemenid period. The terminological problem dates from the Seleucid Empire, which applied the term Syria, the Greek and Indo-Anatolian form of the name Assyria, which had existed even during the Assyrian Empire, not only to both of Syria and the Assyrians themselves in northern Mesopotamia, but also to lands to the west in the Levant, which had never been a part of Assyria, previously known as Aramea, Ebonari and Phoenicia. This caused not only the Assyrians of Mesopotamia, but also the ethnically and geographically distinct Arameans and Phoenicians of the Levant to be collectively called Syrians and Syriacs in the Greco-Roman world. Syriac Christianity was established in Syriac and Eastern Aramaic-speaking Assyria and Western Aramaic-speaking Aramea during the 1st to 5th centuries AD. The Church of the East was founded amongst the Assyrians in Assyria between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Aramea was also home to significant communities The Syriac Orthodox Church and Maronite Church emerged in this region. Until the 7th century AD Arab Islamic conquests, Syriac Christianity was divided between two empires: Sassanid Persia in the east and Rome, Byzantium in the west. The Western group in Syria, the Eastern in Assyria and Persian Assyria and Mesopotamia. Syriac Christianity was divided from the 5th century over questions of Christological dogma, viz., Nestorianism in the east and monophysitism and diaphysitism in the west. Medieval Syriac authors show awareness of the descent of the language from the ancient Arameans, without however using Aramean as an ethnic self-designation. Thus, Michael the Great wrote, "Modern history, the controversy is not restricted to exonyms like English, Assyrian versus Aramean, but also applies to self-designation in Neo-Aramaic. The Aramean faction from Syria endorses both Syria and Aramaic, while the Assyrian faction from Iraq, Iran, northeast Syria and southeast Turkey insists on Atri but also accepts Syria. Assyria is generally accepted by scholars to be a derivative of Atri, and to originally mean and apply specifically to Assyrians and Assyria. Syria naming controversy. The question of ethnic identity and self-designation is sometimes connected to the scholarly debate on the etymology of Syria. The question has a long history of academic controversy, but majority mainstream opinion currently strongly favors that Syria is indeed ultimately derived from the Assyrian term Ashur-iu. Meanwhile, a minority of scholars in the past rejected the theory of Syrian being derived from Assyrian as naive. The term Syria in its Indo-Anatolian form was first recorded during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and in its original sense applied specifically and solely to the land of Assyria and its Assyrian people, which apart from the modern Al-Hasaka region in northeast Syria and its surrounds, does not correspond geographically to modern Syria, but rather to northern Iraq and southeast Turkey. During the Akkadian Empire, Neo-Sumerian Empire and Old Assyrian Empire, the region which is now Syria was known as the land of the Amurru. Following these periods, during the Middle Assyrian Empire, Neo-Assyrian Empire and the succeeding Neo-Babylonian Empire and Achaemenid Empire, the region which is modern Syria was known as Ebonari and Aramea. The term Syria emerged only during the 9th century BC and was only used by Indo-Anatolian and Greek speakers and solely in reference to Assyria. However, aside from its usage in reference to Assyria during the Assyrian Empire, there appears to have been clear evidence in ancient times supporting the favored opinion that Syria was synonymous with Assyria. Writing in the 5th century BC, Herodotus stated that those called Syrians by the Greeks were called Assyrians by themselves and in the east. However, Herodotus distinguished between the names Syria and Assyria, and for him personally, Syrians are the inhabitants of the Levant. Randolph Helm emphasized that Herodotus never applied the term Syria on the Mesopotamian region of Assyria, which he always called Assyria. In Greek usage, Syria and Assyria were used almost interchangeably in specific reference to Assyria, although Herodotus's clarifications were a notable early exception. Herodotus points out that the people the Greeks call Assyrians were called by themselves and the barbarians as Assyrians. In the 1st century prior to the dawn of Christianity, the geographer Strabo confirms Herodotus's statement by writing that, when those who have written histories about the Syrian Empire say that the Medes were overthrown by the Persians and the Syrians by the Medes, they mean by the Syrians no other people than those who built the royal palaces in Ninus, and of these Syrians, Ninus was the man who founded Ninus in Aturia, and his wife, Semiramis, was the woman who succeeded her husband. Now, the city of Ninus was wiped out immediately after the overthrow of the Syrians. It was much greater than Babylon, and was situated in the plain of Assyria. Although the mention of Ninus as having founded Assyria is inaccurate, as is the claim that Semiramis was his wife, the salient point in Strabo's statement is the recognition that the Greek term Syria historically meant Assyria. Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, describes the inhabitants of the state of Osrhoene as Assyrians. Osrhoene was a Syriac-speaking state based around Edessa. Justinus, the Roman historian, wrote in 300 AD, "The Assyrians, who are afterwards called Syrians, held their empire 1300 years." The 21st century AD discovery of the Chinekoi inscription appears to conclusively prove that the term Syria derives from Assyria, and originally meant only Assyria and Assyrian. The Chinekoi inscription is a hieroglyphic Luwian Phoenician bilingual uncovered from Chinekoi, Adana province, Turkey, dating to the 8th century BC. Originally published by Tekoğlu and Lemaire, it was more recently the subject of a 2006 paper published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, in which the author, Robert Rollinger, lends strong support to the age-old debate of the name Syria being derived from Assyria. The examined section of the Luwian inscription reads, Section via then, an Assyrian king, and the whole Assyrian house, were made a father for me. Section 7 and Hiua and Assyria, were made a single house. Quote, the corresponding Phoenician inscription reads, the object on which the inscription is found is a monument belonging to Uriki, vassal king of Hiua, dating to the 8th century BC. In this monumental inscription, Uriki made reference to the relationship between his kingdom and his Assyrian overlords. The Luwian inscription reads Sura I, whereas the Phoenician translation reads Senia or Ashur, which, according to Rollinger, settles the problem once and for all. Rudolf McCutch points out that the Eastern Neo-Aramaic press of the 19th century initially accepted and used the term Syrian, and only much later, with the rise of nationalism, switched back to the earlier Assyrian. According to Sateli, however, a Georgian equivalent of Assyrians appears in ancient Georgian, Armenian and Russian documents. This correlates with the theory of the nations and peoples to the east and north of Mesopotamia always knew the group as Assyrians, while to the west, beginning with Luwian, Hurran and later Greek influence, the Assyrians were known as Syrians. Syria being an Indo-European corruption of Assyria. Purely theological terms such as Nestorian, Jacobite and Chaldean Catholic emerged much later. Nestorian only emerged after the Nestorian schism of the 5th and 6th centuries AD, and Chaldean Catholic only in the late 18th century AD, subsequent to a number of Assyrians in northern Iraq breaking from the Assyrian Church of the East. Both of these terms are explicitly and solely denominational, and not ethnic in any sense, and both were applied to Syriac Christians by European outsiders. In an ethnic sense, Semitic and Greek writers both before and long after the advent of Christianity only used the terms Assyrian, Syrian and Aramean, and the terms Nestorian and Jacobite are not used in this way, with Chaldean not being found anywhere in any sense until the late 17th century AD. The historical English term for the group is Syrians. It is not now in use, since after the 1936 declaration of the Syrian Arab Republic, the term Syrian has come to designate citizens of that state regardless of ethnicity, with Syriac Arameans and Assyrians only being indigenous ethnic minorities within that nation. The designation Assyrians has also become current in English besides the traditional Syrians since at least the Assyrian genocide of the 1910s, although the term was used by European travelers as far back as the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it is important to note that it was always in continual use in the Near East in various forms when describing the Christians of Mesopotamia, including Ashurayu, Assyrian, Ashuriyun, Asori, Atoria, Athari, Atori, etc. The adjective Syriac properly refers to the Syriac language exclusively and is not a demonym. The OED explicitly still recognizes this usage alone. A adjective of or pertaining to Syria, only of or in reference to the language, written in Syriac writing, or versed in Syriac. B.N. The ancient Semitic language of Mesopotamia and Syria, formerly in wide use, has nevertheless come into common use as a demonym following the declaration of the Syrian Arab Republic to avoid the ambiguity of Syrians. Limited de facto use of Syriacs, in the sense of authors writing in the Syriac language in the context of patristics, can be found even before World War I. Since the 1980s, a dispute between, on the one hand, the Akkadian-infused East Aramaic-speaking Assyrians, who are indigenous Christians from northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, southeastern Turkey, northeastern Syria and the Caucasus, and derive their national identity from the Bronze and Iron Age Assyria, and on the other hand, the now largely Arabic-speaking, but previously West Aramaic-speaking Arameans, who are mainly from central, southwest and northwestern Syria and south-central Turkey, has become ever more pronounced. In the light of this dispute, the traditional English designation Assyrians has come to appear, taking an Assyrianist position, for which reason some official sources in the 2000s have come to use emphatically neutral terminology, such as Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac in the U.S. Census, and Assyria, Syriana in the Swedish Census. In the Aramaic language, the dispute boils down to the question of whether Shure, Syria, Syrian, or Achri, Assyrian, is in preferred use, or whether they are used synonymously. A 2007 Modern Aramaic Dictionary and AMP phrasebook does treat the terms as synonyms. Assyrians call themselves Shure, Syria, Athari, Shuroi, Soyoi, Uroi. The question of the history of each of these terms is less clear. The points to be distinguished are: was the term Achari introduced into Neo-Aramaic in the 19th century, during the early modern period, or has it been in use even in the Middle Aramaic vernacular of the early Christian period and long before? What was the relation of the Greek terms Syria versus Assyria in pre-Christian classical antiquity? What is the ultimate etymological connection of the terms Syria and Assyria? It is undisputed that reference to both the Syrian and Assyrian self-designations were in use by the mid-19th century, even prior to the archaeological discoveries of the late 19th century. According to the Chronicle of the Carmelites in Persia, Pope Paul V shall, in a letter to the Persian Shah Abbas I of the 3rd of November 1612, mentioned that the Jacobites endorsed an Assyrian identity. Those in particular who are called Assyrians are Jacobites and inhabit Isfahan will be compelled to sell their very children in order to pay the heavy tax you have imposed on them, unless you take pity on the misfortune. John Joseph in the Nestorians and the Muslim Neighbors stated that the term Assyrians had for various political reasons been reintroduced to Syriac Christians by British missionaries during the late 19th century, and strengthened by archaeological discoveries of ancient Assyria. In the 1990s, the question was revived by Richard Fry among many others, who disagreed with Joseph, establishing that the term Assyrians had existed amongst the Jacobites, Church of the East and the Nestorians already from the early Christian era and before. Fry further adduces Armenian, Persian, Russian, Arab and Georgian sources to establish the pre modern usage of Assyrian for the Christian group. The two scholars agreed on the fact that confusion has existed between the two similar words, Syria and Assyria, throughout history down to our own day, but each accused the other of contributing further to this confusion. In addition, Horatio Southgate came upon people known as Assyrians in the early 19th century, many decades before the archaeological discoveries and missionary activities of Western Christians. The question of the synonymity of Syria versus Assyria was already discussed by classical authors. Herodotus has this people, whom the Greeks call Assyrians, are called Assyrians by the barbarians, while strictly distinguishing the toponym Syria versus Assyria, the former referring to the Levant, the latter to Mesopotamia. Posidonius, when referring to the Levant, has the people we call Syrians were called by the Syrians themselves Arameans. Quite apart from the question of de facto usage, the question of the etymological relation of the two terms had been open until recently. The point of uncertainty was whether the toponym Syria was ultimately derived from the name Ashur. With the 21st century discovery of the Chinekhoi inscription, the question does now appear to have been decisively settled to the effect that Syria does indeed derive from Ashur. Names in diaspora, USA. During the 2000 United States Census, Syriac Orthodox Archbishops Cyril Abram Karim and Clemens Eugene Kaplan issued a declaration that the preferred English designation is Syriacs. The official census avoids the question by listing the group as Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac. Some Maronite Christians also joined this U.S. census. Sweden. In Sweden, this name dispute has its beginning when immigrants from Turkey, belonging to the Syriac Orthodox Church, emigrated to Sweden during the 1960s and were applied with the ethnic designation Assyrians by the Swedish authorities. This caused many from outside Iraq who preferred the indigenous designation Sur-Yo-Yo to protest, which led to the Swedish authorities began using the double term Assyria, Syriana,